Major funding of A Conversation with Jane Goodall is made possible by the Philocology Trust and the Bass Foundation, with additional funding from Half Price Books, Records, and Magazines Incorporated, a nationwide corporation specializing in new and used books and committed to preserving the environment since 1972.
Jane Goodall. She's made the study and preservation of African chimpanzees her life's work.
I always felt from the beginning that I was doing what I was supposed to be doing. The longer I study chimps, the more I realize there is to learn, and the more amazed and impressed I am by the differences between individuals. I think once we accept the whole picture of similarity, it's very humbling because it makes us realize we're not quite as unique as we used to think.
Now, A Conversation with Jane Goodall, hosted by Lee Cullum.
Dr. Goodall, when you first went to Africa, I think your great mentor, Louis Leakey, talked you into doing this study of chimpanzees, and he thought it would take about 10 years. I think in your own mind you thought about 3 years, and your guide thought you'd last 6 months. When did you know this was going to be a life work? When could you see it was going to be more than any of you had ever anticipated?
It was after the first year, I think, when I had to leave Gombe, leave the chimpanzees, go back to England to start my PhD work. And it was then that I realized, you know, how little I'd learned in a year. And the longer I stayed there in those early months, the more I realized that this was a very, very complex being.
But you wrote often of despair. Did you feel despair often? Did you think of quitting?
I never ever thought of quitting. I sometimes despaired that the chimpanzees would ever get used to seeing me there. You know, to start with, they just ran off even if I was 500 meters away. But I wore the same colored clothes, and I didn't try to get too fast, too quickly, and eventually they came to accept me.
You know, in your book, In the Shadow of Man, I remember you dedicated it to Leakey, your great mentor, to your mother, who traveled with you to Gombe in the first place, to your husband, and to David Greybeard,
yes.
To the memory of David Greybeard, a chimp. How did he come to mean so much to you? At least one of them got used to you.
David Greybeard was very special. He was very gentle. Why he was less afraid than his companions, I simply don't know. However, he visited my camp because there were oil nut palms ready for eating. And on one of his visits to camp, he found some bananas lying around and took them. And my African cook was very excited when I got back in the evening and told me. So I said, well, leave some more out tomorrow. And because David Greybeard kept coming back, I decided I would stay down instead of climbing to the mountains and wait for him. And he came and he took the bananas, and he gradually got more and more used to me. And then when I was out in the forests, I would sometimes take a banana in my pocket, and David would come and look to see if I had one, and the other chimps would stare. What is this crazy fellow doing, going up to this frightening white ape? But then gradually they realized too that I wasn't so alarming.
You were the first one to discover that chimpanzees eat meat. Before that, everybody thought they just lived on fruits and berries and that sort of thing. How did you make that discovery?
Was David Greybeard again?
Really?
And
he was your lucky chimp.
He was. I was sitting, there's a wonderful peak from which vantage point in the early days I would sit and scan the valleys and use my binoculars. And then one day, just down below me actually, I saw this chimpanzee climb up, and there was a lot of commotion. I saw a pig down on the ground. There was an adult male baboon in the tree, and then I realized David Greybeard holding something pink and red, and a female and young chimp who were begging from him. And it became clear that this was a young pig. The adult pigs were charging about down below, and every time the young chimp would go and try and pick a scrap off the ground, the adult pig would charge.
You also discovered that they can use tools and even make tools, and this was a very significant discovery.
Yes.
How did you happen to see that?
Once again, David Greybeard. David
Amazing
Greybeard
chimp.
and Goliath. And I couldn't quite, he was still very shy, and I was behind a great tuft of vegetation. But I could see he had this grass stem in his hand, and he was poking it into a termite mound and then apparently eating something off, and I was just not close enough to see. But after he moved away, I went there and I saw all these termites moving around, so I picked up a twig and poked it in, and lo and behold, termites bit on, and I realized he was using it to fish for termites. And when I was able to get closer, then you sometimes see a chimp pick a leafy twig and strip the leaves off, or a wide blade of grass and strip the blades off the side.
And wouldn't the chimp Everett use leaves as a sponge?
Yeah, they do, to sop up water.
Yes.
That was what excited Louis Leakey, because when I discovered tool using and tool modifying, tool making, he made this famous remark, because up to that time it was man the tool maker. That separated us from the rest of the animal kingdom, it was thought. And Louis said, well, now we must redefine man, redefine tool, or accept chimpanzees as humans.
I was quite struck to realize that the similarities between chimps and human beings are 95%, even 99%, I think you have written. We have the same DNA structure, we have the same blood protein structure, we have the same immune response system. I think Stephen Jay Gould said in his introduction to your book, In the Shadow of Man, that in that 5% or even less lies the biological essence of humanity. What do you think you've learned about humanity? What is that 5% or less? What is its essence?
Well, these structures, these similarities in the DNA and blood and so forth, are the very reason why chimpanzees have been used as models for humans in medical research. And the similarities in behavior, in emotion and intellect, which are equally striking to these physiological similarities, scientists haven't been so eager to accept those for the most part. And I think once we accept the whole picture of similarity, it's very humbling, because it makes us realize we're not quite as unique as we used to think.
We are creatures.
And we're creatures too. We're not on an isolated pinnacle separated from the rest of the animal kingdom by an unbridgeable chasm. And if you will, the chimpanzee, because of his similarities to us, helps us to conceptually bridge that gap. And I hope will lead us through a different perception of our own place in nature to regard the rest of the animal kingdom with more respect.
I think you also wrote that you saw from time to time the beginnings of moral behavior in the chimps.
I think we see in chimpanzees, for example, in begging, food sharing, and I can't remember the exact context I said it in, but they certainly acknowledge the rights of another chimpanzee in some circumstances.
To the carcass?
Yes.
Rights to the
carcass. Yes, that's right. And they will also go and calm, reassure, and be very gentle with a clearly frightened or hurt subordinate. And it's those kind of things which make one believe that if chimpanzees had developed a spoken language, which they haven't, then a lot of the feelings and emotions, which in a way are trapped within them because of the lack of words, might have developed into some kind of moral value system. It would be hard for us to have evolved that without a language, I think.
And yet they seem to know how to do all sorts of things. They know the language for the deaf, the sign language.
It can be taught.
It can be taught, yes, exactly.
Taught about 300 signs, and they can use those in novel combinations, and they can invent a sign if they haven't been taught it. And perhaps most significant, one infant who'd been taught no signs by a human, who never saw human signing, but who lived with his foster mother and 3 other signing chimps. By the time he was 8.5, he had acquired 59 signs. Each one had been used at least once in the proper context.
What about the male hierarchy? They have a very clear hierarchy, do they not, in the chimp world?
They have usually a top ranking or alpha male, and then number 2, 3, 4, 5. However, coalitions get formed, and so very often you have a situation where perhaps 3 and 4 may be able to dominate 2 when they're together. But by and large, 1 makes it to the top. And what's been so fascinating is that each male who's made it to this clearly highly coveted position has used slightly different techniques.
Well, Mike, for example, simply used cleverness, kicking the cans.
That's right. And he reigned for 6 years as a result. He intimidated the others. The males have these fantastic splendid charging displays when their hair bristles and they scowl and they leap up, shake and sway the vegetation, and they drag great branches and they hurl big rocks. They really make themselves look bigger and more dangerous than they may actually be. And the great thing here is if you can intimidate your rival without having to fight, so much the better, because you could be hurt in a fight. And Mike, by using empty kerosene cans from my camp, had a fantastic, noisy display.
Now, Flo was the dominant female. There's a female hierarchy also, isn't there?
It's a very unstable, much less clear-cut hierarchy, because a female, her relationship with each other female will depend on the family members with each one at the time. So if a female is with her adolescent son, for example, and she meets another female who's only with her juvenile daughter, then female number one with the adolescent son will dominate. But if on another occasion her adolescent son isn't there, then she will lose. So it's changing all the time. But
so she needs to be accompanied by adolescent sons to prevail.
Adolescent or adult sons, or if she has an adult daughter as opposed to a juvenile son of the other female. And of course, once you get to adolescence, you begin spending time away from your mother, increasingly. So it's always, the female never knows, how she's going to be able to relate to another female.
You raised an infant right there in the middle of this chimpanzee community. How did you manage that? You kept him in a cage during the day so he'd be safe.
When he was a tiny baby,
yes.
Pre-walking, he was in a cage in a building,
yes.
Because chimps are hunters and they have been known to take human infants. And then he moved down to the beach where the chimps very seldom come, and his cage, if you want to call it that, was a large veranda with weld mesh around it. And he stayed in there unless he was with one of us adults playing on the beach, which is pretty safe.
But you said that you learned quite a lot about mothering from the chimps.
I really was impressed, and still am, by a chimpanzee mother's dedication to raising her family. And she has the good mother anyway, they're not all equally good, but a good mother has infinite patience. She's affectionate, she's tolerant, she can impose her will on her child, she can impose discipline. And these kind of mothers tend to raise youngsters who become assertive and self-confident, whereas the females who are more restrictive, less affectionate, less playful, tend to have youngsters who don't do so well. I mean, it's really interesting. However, although I thought from watching chimpanzee mothers and seeing how much actual enjoyment they get from their infants, that I would model my behavior on a chimp female when my son was small, it turns out actually I was raised in very much that way myself, and I may have done it anyway.
Well, Flint, Flos Son, as I recall, was so grieved when she died that he died within 3 weeks.
Yes.
An amazing tie.
He had a very abnormal relationship with his mother. He was unusually dependent, and I think it was because when it came to time to wean him, and he was 4, because chimp youngsters do actually nurse for 5 years, then Flo was so old that she just seemed not to have the strength to push him towards independence. And when she then became pregnant and had an infant, this drained even more of her strength, and she kept giving in and letting Flint ride on her back, ride on her belly, share her nest at night. And although that baby died, nevertheless, Flint remained dependent on Flo. And she was much more prepared to take him back now she'd lost the new baby. And so when Flo died, it was as though he'd lost his whole world. And he fell into a state of grieving. He refused food. He wasn't interested in the other chimps. Immune system weakened, and he died.
And Flo was written up in the London Times.
Yeah,
she had a formal obituary, I believe. Yes. One of the mothers who was not so good was Passion. I was really stunned by her. I mean, first of all, she was a very indifferent mother to Pom. And then this cannibalism in which they engaged was just appalling.
It was unbelievably grotesque. Passion was a harsh mother, and Pom didn't really have a very good infancy because Passion was cold, she didn't play very often. She would leave Pom behind before Pom could walk properly, and Pom was always whimpering and trying to grab on, and she'd actually play holding Mother with one hand because she was so insecure, maybe Mother would get up and go and leave her behind. But as Pom grew up then the relationship between mother and daughter suddenly became close. It was like, you know, you get human mothers, don't you, who don't like tiny babies as much as they like older children. It seemed to be like that with Passion. And by the time Pom was an adolescent, they had this close bond, and then began this horrifying, grim 4-year period when together this mother-daughter team were hunting, killing and eating newborn babies of females in their own group.
Melissa, they ate Melissa's baby, as I recall.
2 of them.
2?
Mm.
But Melissa kept going over to Passion for reassurance. It was amazing, wanted to be comforted by Passion.
Well, it was just after Passion had attacked her so violently and injured her so badly, and just before Passion carried the carcass up the tree, the dead baby. And Melissa was bewildered, frightened, bleeding. She was really gashed up, trembling because she had her hands gashed, her face bleeding, her back bleeding. And in this state of fear and I suppose shock, here is a much higher ranking female who has been attacking her. And so Melissa reached out towards her with this asking for reassurance. And in response, Passion reassured her. In other words, now I've got your baby, I don't want to hurt you anymore. Mm. And then she carried the dead baby up a tree, and Melissa was too weak to follow. So she just sat below and watched.
And there were gang attacks also in this chimp world. It was not all nirvana.
Absolutely not. The gang attacks are typically those that are perpetrated by these patrolling males I was talking about. If they see a stranger from a neighboring community, they're likely to chase and attack very, very brutally. And when you have a fight between members of the same community, it's very rare for that fight to last more than a quarter of a minute, and it's very rare that it results in wounding. But when you attack a stranger, then the wounding is terrible, and in fact the victim may die.
I think one of the worst things you lived through in Gombe was the polio epidemic. That must have been a terrible thing. You were expecting your own child at the time,
it was,
I think.
Yes. And one after the other, our friends would come in trailing a crippled limb. 2 we had to shoot, Mr. McGregor and McD, because they could no longer survive. They were too badly crippled. And some of the chimps we never saw again. We just assumed that they'd fallen victim and died somewhere in the forest.
And you said that the chimps withdrew from McGregor. As it became clear that he was growing more and more ill, he would approach them and want to take part in the group, and they would withdraw and have nothing to do with him. It was very cruel.
He only survived about 10 days after getting polio, and he couldn't use either leg. So his movements were bizarre, they were unnatural, and the chimps were actually frightened of him. And then this fear gave place to aggression, and it was an aggression caused by fear. They shunned him because they were frightened of him. And we find much the same thing in children of our own species. Children are frightened by abnormal behavior, unusual, bizarre movements. They withdraw from it, and then you will find the same cruel tendency to jeer at a crippled child. It's something we have to teach in our society for this to be accepted.
Yes, that's true. You know, it seems to me you have lived a very austere and pure life. You seem to have been in exactly the right place for you, doing exactly what you needed to do. Did you feel that way about it?
I always felt from the beginning that I was doing what I was supposed to be doing. You know, in the early days I'd be sleeping up on the peak with a blanket over me and I'd hear a leopard. And what would I do? Pull the blanket over my head. You know, I'm meant to be here, it's going to be all right.
You said you want to spend the rest of your life in Gombe, or at least stay there long enough to train someone to follow you, and yet you're obliged to travel a great deal, making speeches and doing fundraising and all the rest to promote your work. Is that difficult now?
It's not what I'd rather be doing. It's, however, essential. And the things that I'm talking about, the things that it's necessary to raise public awareness about, for one is the endangered status of the chimpanzee in Africa, in the wild. And secondly, the very bad conditions in which many chimpanzees are maintained in captivity, whether these be zoos, circuses, filmmaking, or the biomedical laboratories. The worst one I visited is just outside Washington, D.C., where there were a room full of cages, each one containing 2 infant chimpanzees, about two years old, cage size 22 inches by 22 inches and 2 foot high. I mean, imagine that. They could barely turn around, and they were just in quarantine. And in fact, those cages did not comply with federal regulations, even though it was totally federally funded, all the research in that lab. But it's still perfectly legal in this country and in Europe to maintain chimps in cages 5 foot by 5 foot, 7 foot high, nothing in there, totally sterile, maybe a motor tire to sit on if they're lucky, quite alone. And this can be for life, and a chimp can live 50 years.
I know that you have real questions in your own mind about doing medical research with chimps at all.
Well, I sort of happen to think that we as a species have been very arrogant in our assumption that other animals are just there for us to use. I can see how it happened. You know, if you go back to our early ancestors battling to survive, and other animals were ways of feeding and keeping themselves warm in the winter. But, you know, we should have come slightly beyond that. One of our human attributes, I think, is compassion and understanding. And now that it's no longer believed, even by scientists, that animals are mere machines, we have to think of new ways of regarding them. And the sad thing is that today medical science is sort of shored up by animal research. It's accepted by everybody that we have to have animals in order to make progress. In fact, people have told me, it's not my field, I don't know, but I've talked a lot to people in this research field, and there are those who believe that alternatives to the use of any live animals are just around the corner. There are already cell tissue alternatives, computer simulation alternatives. They can grow human organs in little dishes. And if you can use these kind of methods and do away with the use, at least of most live animals, what a much more healthy society for us to live in, so that our medical help is not coming from torturing animals, because it does amount to torture from the animal's point of view.
Yes, from what you've written, they feel pain, they suffer, they feel anguish, they feel grief.
That's right.
And we assume they don't.
We, not meaning myself, I know that they do. And you see, chimpanzees, they certainly have emotions similar to joy and sadness, fear and despair. Certainly they feel pain, so do dogs and cats and mice. And chimpanzees have intellectual abilities that we used to think totally unique to humans.
They can paint. I was amazed to hear you say they can paint.
Not only can they paint and draw, but they enjoy it. They will do it for no reward except the delight of putting marks and creating patterns and colors on paper. And you know that research shows they even have a schema for certain objects. So one chimpanzee, this is a chimpanzee who knew sign language, and she was signed to draw a brush. So she made marks like this. And a whole year later, she was again asked, brush, and she did the same sort of thing. So she had her schema in her mind. One chimpanzee made a mark like this on the paper. Sign, what is it? Ball. Isn't that amazing? What's the chimp done? Picked the movement of a bouncing ball. You see, the bounce.
Oh, of course.
We would do a circle. She did the movement.
She had been interested in the movement.
Representational art. And some of their paintings are beautiful. I mean, they're just marks, but they will label them, the signing chimps.
And when you say that they are labeled, how do the chimps communicate the label? With the sign language?
The signs.
I see.
They're signs.
I remember your writing once that perhaps in the dark of night or in the sunrise, one might have a flash of knowledge that passeth all understanding, maybe just once. Has that ever happened to you?
Well, I think it happens fairly often with the chimpanzees, a sort of intuitive understanding of what a gesture means or something. I don't really have examples, but a lot of understanding of chimpanzees that I feel I've gained has come through intuition rather than just cold scientific observation. I think what's, you know, the longer I study chimps, the more I realize there is to learn, and the more amazed and impressed I am by the differences between individuals. They're quite as separate one from another. They have just such vivid personalities as we have.
Yes, I found in looking at your Chimpanzees of Gombe, the beautiful book, I guess it's your most recent, that it's like looking through a family album. You look at the pictures, you think, oh, there's Flo.
Yes.
And you remember what you've read about her, and of course Palm and Passion appear in that book often.
Yes, chimpanzees actually have their history. The community has its history with the grim days of the polio, the Passion and Pom killing the different males who make it to the top and reign like kings.
That's right. One could write a history of
Absolutely.
A life and times of Gombe.
Absolutely. I mean, really one could. And, the sad thing is, coming from this discussion about individual differences and the amount that there is to know, in each place in Africa, across the range, you will have different communities, different cultures, different histories, different individuals, and the opportunity to learn about that is going so fast. Chimps have already gone from 4 countries in Africa where they were plentiful at the turn of the century. They're just clinging on by a few scattered groups in 5 other countries. They were present in 25.
There were a million, or millions, you said, at the turn of the century, and only 250,000 today.
Approximately. And it's only in 4 countries in the central part of Africa where we really find plentiful populations. And the sad thing is, this reduction in numbers of chimps is due to habitat destruction, as everywhere. It's due to the fact that chimps are shot for food, and also chimpanzee mothers are shot so that babies can be stolen from them, to be sold as pets, or to be exported, usually illegally, by dealers to other parts of the world. And so many die for every baby that makes it to wherever it's going to go.
Getting back to that 1 or 2% that makes up humanness, I think you wrote that human beings managed to overcome the selfish gene. Do we really?
I think we can. Whether we do or not is up to each individual to decide for him or herself.
You said that the chimps undoubtedly will evolve, and where do you think they might be millions of years from now?
Unless we can really do something to help them, they won't be there in millions of years, any more than we will. People often say to me, do you think there's any hope for us, for the chimps, for the planet? Well, I have great faith in human nature. And I think if you'd asked people 100 years ago, most people would say, no, people can never fly, no, they can never get to the moon, that's science fiction. But we've done those things. And, the great hope for us is the fact that a new awareness is growing all around the world about the hurt that we've inflicted on the planet and the kinds of ways that we can set about to try and repair that hurt. And if we all pull together, now that we understand, then I believe there is hope for the future. And young people want to help so much.
Are we showing them the way? Are we giving them a way of action?
I think that we're not being concise enough, but I think the really important message for young people is that each single one of them, each one of us, we can all make a difference. We can make conscious choices to do things that are the least damaging to the environment. And it will be some cost to each of us, but we still can make that choice.
Major funding of A Conversation with Jane Goodall is made possible by the Philocology Trust and the Bass Foundation, with additional funding from Half Price Books, Records, and Magazines Incorporated, a nationwide corporation specializing in new and used books and committed to preserving the environment since 1972.